Hello, folks. Scott Guile from Macmillan. Thank you for your time today. I know that everyone and their brother has been inviting you to a webinar recently, and I truly believe this one is going to prove to be a good use of your time. And that does not advance my slides, but that does. Before we get started, I just wanted to review with you the tools in GoToWebinar so you know what you're looking at on your screen. In the top right corner of your screen, you should see an orange arrow. If you click it, a menu like the one pictured on the screen pops out. There is a questions area. We do want you to use that. You guys are muted because of the number of attendees and ambient noise, but we want to communicate with you, and we do so via questions. If you want to pop those features out, in other words, if you want them to come into the middle of your screen and be a little bigger, either the audio, the questions, whatever it is that you're working with, just click that little square, it will pop out. Lastly, if you're not seeing the webinar, if it disappears for some reason, in all likelihood, it was because this blue flower got clicked. This will minimize and maximize the view of the webinar you have on your screen. It will not close the webinar. So don't be afraid to click that blue flower if you want it down or up for whatever purpose. So today's webinar is focusing mostly on Achieve, Read, and Practice, which is an adaptive quizzing product that we brought it out to market about 2 years ago. It is, however, based on Learning Curve adaptive quizzing and an ebook. Learning Curve has actually been in use for over a decade. It's gone through transformations, UX, visual updates, functional updates, but the system itself is over a decade old. And as such, we've literally talked to hundreds of thousands of students, semester end survey type of stuff. And it's got a 90% student approval rating. That means on a 5-point scale, 90% of the students give it a 4 or a 5, which is, and we survey a lot of people on a lot of stuff. That is an extraordinary rating. It makes you sit up and take notice. And hopefully makes you as well, makes me. Lastly, and this is important, real important, it's affordable, it's mobile, and it's simple. In other words, student can easily use it on their phone, and it is very affordable, and it's simple for you, simple for students. Affordability wise, this is what we're talking about, some examples from history. If you go to archiverp.com, you can see all the titles available and read more, by the way. Here's an example from Psych, and these are just random examples. There's a lot more than this, 39, and this includes an ebook. Remember, this is the ebook and the quizzing. Some examples from our geography list. We again do have others. Please go to archiverp.com if you want to see any others. So on to the scientific part of our program. Kara McWilliams has a PhD and a master's from Boston College, PhD on educational research and a master's in curriculum and instruction. She's got over 10 years experience conducting qualitative, quantitative research into improving learner outcomes. And she's been wonderful in the development of this product. Some of you on this may have at some point interacted with her because she's very active in the field and very involved in all of our testing. I am now going to kick it over to Kara to take it away.
Thank you, Scott. So I will share my screen now. Scott, can you see my screen now?
Coming up. Yep, we got it.
Okay, great. So as Scott said, I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about the research that we've done on Achieve, Read, and Practice, specifically on the impact research that we've done to validate the learning science foundations of the tool and to develop a portfolio of evidence of efficacy that we can offer instructors when they're deciding which tools to use in the classroom. We found that a robust body of evidence that spans everywhere from survey research all the way up through quasi-experimental and experimental designs, each add a little piece of evidence to the efficacy portfolio that can be used in a specific way to allow for relevant decisions to be made for instructors. So while our webinar is very brief today, we don't want to take up too much of your time. I just want to highlight some of those learning science foundations of Achieve, Read, and Practice and how we have worked to validate them. So we'll be talking about those foundations. I'll quickly go over the study design. We'll then talk about instructor and student perceptions of the tool, the cognitive and non-cognitive impacts of read and practice, and then I'll hand the webinar back over to Scott, who will walk you through some of those features that I'll have gone through in the presentation so that you can actually see firsthand what these features and capabilities are that we have been studying and that I have been talking through. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box and I'll be sure to answer them. Probably will answer them at the end of the webinar, but certainly if there are questions throughout, I will be keeping an eye out and will be happy to answer them. So starting with the learning science of Achieve, Read, and Practice, at Macmillan Learning, our approach to learning science is that the science of learning begins early in product development. So as Scott said, Read and Practice is adapted from Learning Curve, a tool that's been around for a very long time. And Learning Curve had been based on learning science foundations from the beginning. But as the tool adapted into Read and Practice, we were able to use some of the learning researchers and the learning scientists we have on staff here to add additional features and capabilities that made the tool, while still very simple, more robust and aligned to what we know about how people learn the best. So Read and Practice is built on the foundation of a couple of learning science principles. First is retrieval practice. What we know is that as students practice, it makes perfect. And so the more students answer certain questions, the better that we expect them to do on future summative assessments. So for example, in early research of Read and Practice, we found that students who use the tool to study for exams, so if they retake quizzes that were assigned to them earlier in the semester as practice, they actually do better on their in-class exams than students who did not retake those quizzes for practice. So using that retrieval practice through Read and Practice actually impacts their future academic performance. There are also features in Read and Practice that promote student motivation. So you might see in Read and Practice that there is a progress bar. In addition to adding sort of a gamified feature, the progress bar helps motivate students to meet the goal. As they see the bar increasing or reducing or getting closer, they stay committed to reaching the goal that their instructor has set for them. Self-regulation is also apparent in Read and Practice. Both the progress bar and an indication of what is coming due, so what activities are coming due, how students are progressing on them, helps students self-regulate their learning, which we know is an important study skill, particularly for subgroups of students that we want to focus on the most in higher education. Chunking is also important in Read and Practice. So the ebook that is in the tool, the reading is displayed in manageable chunks. So students aren't faced with a whole extensive set of reading that they don't think that they're going to be able to manage. They can read those sections in chunks which make it much more manageable and consumable for them. There is also segmentation in the reading. Where this is really helpful is when students are answering the quizzes in Read and Practice, they can be directed back to the segment of the reading where the answer to that question can be found. So they're not playing a game of trying to find it throughout the entire reading. And there has been some discussion about, well, I don't want to promote my student just going right to the answers and going to the section of the reading where they can find the answer. But what our research has shown is that one, students aren't likely to actually engage in those behaviors, but two, even just directing students back to those sections promotes the reading of those sections. So while in some cases students don't do any of the reading, sending them back to the section where the answers can be found, make sure they're reading those chunks and that segmentation, which can actually enhance their likelihood to do the reading. And then certainly Read and Practice is based on formative assessment. So because of the way that Read and Practice is developed, such that the student is expected to reach a target score, it is not considered a summative assessment. They're given various attempts to answer questions. They can continue answering questions until they reach the target. Students will have a different number of questions that they've answered. This is very much based on all of the principles we know about formative assessment. This is good because what instructors can do is they can use the results of these formative assessments to direct their instruction. Some of the research that we've done on read and practice have been called implementation studies. And we've actually looked at how instructors have used read and practice. And one of the most popular ways to use read and practice is as a pre-class activity. So instructors assign read and practice before they're going to lecture on the information that is in the reading and the associated quiz. And then right before they are teaching the course, they look at the results of the formative assessment, and they can use this to modify their lecture, focus on the topics that they see students are struggling with, and really allow for just-in-time teaching or directed instruction, which we find is really great with formative assessment. And we also know that increased formative assessment through retrieval practice supports performance on summative assessment. So all of the research that we've done and everything we know about how people learn would lead us to the hypothesis that these learning science foundations will support cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes among students. So I'm going to talk about the study design from the results that we're going to go through quickly today. But before I do, I just wanted to introduce you to the fact that this study is the fourth in a series of studies that have been done on Achieve, Read, and Practice. The way that we think about validity and efficacy research is that you can't just jump to an experimental study of impact because you lose so much of the really important information and you lose the opportunity to really support product development and product optimization. So the impact research team at Macmillan began studying read and practice when it was early in development in beta testing with survey research, qualitative data through interviews, focus groups, things like that to provide feedback to the product development team as they were developing Achieve, a read and practice. And then once the tool was being used in classrooms, we had implementation studies where, as I said, we really looked closely at the documentation and the platform data of how the tool was being used, how students were engaging in it, and what the correlational findings were between use and outcomes. We then replicated that study to understand if when used with a more generalizable sample, those findings remained. Once we had a really good understanding of how the tool was used, how students were engaging in it, and the tool had been optimized by the product development team, we then implemented the study that we'll talk about today, which was a quasi-experimental design. So the way that we conducted this comparison study is that 11 instructors partnered with Macmillan Learning to participate in this study. We went through all of the practices that we are required to ensure that we were conducting an ethical study. We had 2 stages of institutional review board approval. First, a third party reviewed our study. A third party IRB reviewed our study to ensure that it was ethical and that no human subjects would be harmed. And then we engaged with each of the institutions where instructors partnered with us to make sure that we were aligned with their institutional review board approvals, things like gaining student-informed consent, understanding which data we were allowed to capture, helping the institutions understand how we would collect, store, and then subsequently destroy those data, protecting all of the rights of the students and the instructors in our study. Once we got through all of those institutional review board approvals, these instructors were teaching at least 2 sections of a psychology course. And while we focused specifically on psychology in this study, it's important to note that we have done other studies in other disciplines, and there is reason to believe that many of the findings can resonate in those other disciplines. But in these psychology courses that we looked at, instructors used Achieve, Read, and Practice in one of the sections, and in their other section, they used business as usual. So this broke down into 3 groups. One was that they were either not using digital at all. The second was that they were using a Macmillan Learning tool that was not learning curve because we knew that that would confound the study since Read and Practice was based on learning curve. And the third was a competitor's tool. So we didn't mandate what they were to use in their other section. It was just essentially business as usual, not Read and Practice. So we'll quickly go through some of the perceptions, the comparative perceptions of instructors and students. The instructor perceptions they were asked at the end of the semester to complete the same post survey for both of their sections, their read and practice section and their control section. What we were hoping to glean from these survey data was to understand if some of the assumptions that we had about read and practice changing classroom behaviors and student behaviors were actually doing so. We had some preliminary evidence based on the other studies that we had conducted on read and practice that they did, but we wanted to understand if when compared to another section where instructors weren't using the tool, we also found these differences. So what you're looking at here are the green bars are the ratings on a scale of 1 to 4, how instructors perceived that activity in their section where they use read and practice, and the blue bar is in their control section. So for example, the top bar, you can see that instructors perceived students coming to class prepared at a much higher rate in the sections where they were using read and practice than in their control sections where it was sort of business as usual. Another one that's interesting here is that instructors perceived that they could easily assess where students were comprehending material in the sections where they were using read and practice. And if you remember what I said earlier in the slides, this is important because we really want to promote that just-in-time teaching through the idea of pre-class formative assessment. And by instructors being to easily assess whether students are comprehending the material, that helps that just-in-time teaching. We certainly don't want to add to the burden of instructors having to weed through a lot of data to sort of understand who's understanding what, where the comprehension is. The insights that are provided within read and practice are meant to be really easily consumable, so it saves instructors time understanding what's going on with the comprehension, and then saving them time in the classroom because they can focus specifically on the areas where students aren't comprehending the material because they know they don't have to focus on the areas where they have comprehended it through the pre-class activities. The other one that's interesting here you can see is knowing which of my students were struggling prior to assessments. What we found through this study is that instructors who use read and practice were more in the sections where read and practice was used, instructors were more likely to individually intervene with students before assessments. Because of the data that are provided in read and practice, they could quickly and easily identify the students who they expected would struggle on their in-class assessments. And so they were able to individually intervene with them before getting to those assessments. You could see they did not rate that as highly in their control sections where read and practice wasn't being used. So the data that you see on this slide was really helpful to validate those assumptions that we had based on the generative learning science research that we had done when developing and optimizing Achieve. Certainly, we wanted to understand the student perceptions as well. Obviously, the student perceptions comparatively are a little bit more challenging because students aren't using read and practice in one section and not using it in another. So the way that we had to ask students about their perception of read and practice is asking them to compare it to another course that they were taking where read and practice wasn't being used. So it's not quite the same comparison that we see on the instructor side, but it's also good to provide some context for how students were perceiving their behaviors and their interaction with the tools. What we found with the student perceptions is that students perceived that they were coming to class more prepared to participate than normal. They comprehended the material in the course where read and practice was being used. They even attended the classes more than they suggested they typically would do. And what we know from learning science research is that, and educational research, is that students who feel more prepared to attend class and feel more confident that they're going to be able to participate in class discussion are more likely to attend class more regularly. So by assigning read and practice in a pre-class way and giving them that confidence that they'll be able to confidently participate enables that increase in classroom attendance, and students are perceiving that that was the case in this semester. So again, a lot of the student behaviors that we expected to validate were validated with this survey research. So certainly we wanted to look at the cognitive impact because we want to understand whether the use of this formative assessment tool was actually moving the needle in terms of summative academic performance. The way that we did this is that we wanted to compare the exam grades and final course grades of the students in the sections where Achieve, Read, and Practice was being used and in the sections where the control situation was being used. What we all know, though, is that we can't just look at those general comparisons. And we see this a lot in market research where we just say, oh, last semester I didn't use the tool, this semester I did, and my grade, my students' grades went up half a grade. What we know is that there are so many factors that can contribute to the differences in those grades. So by using a quasi-experimental design like this, we can make sure that we wash out all of those other things that might be contributing to those factors. For example, we suggest that a student's level of academic preparedness coming into the course is obviously going to impact how they do in the course, regardless of what tools they're using or what their study skills look like. Just their academic preparedness alone is important, as is their level of self-motivation coming into the class. So if a student comes into the class and they are more highly motivated to complete their reading, to complete their assignments on time, to come to class, if they are motivated by the grade they're going to get in that class, that if they're motivated by future, by future careers or things like that, that level of motivation will impact their future academic performance. And then, of course, we know that there is specific background and demographic information that will influence their future academic performance. Because we gain IRB approval and because we have students actively informed consent to participate in these studies, we are able to collect a ton of data that other folks generally collect. Because we have these data, we can then control for it at the analysis level. So we can ensure that when we're comparing the results of the section that used Read and Practice with the section that didn't, those results can actually be attributed to the impact that the tool had, as opposed to the possibility that it's being impacted by all of these other things, which is really important when it comes to educational research and efficacy research. So we hypothesize that after controlling for the factors that we know to be related to academic performance, using Read and Practice would significantly impact student exam scores and their overall final course grades. What you see here is that there was an impact on the final exam scores when Achieve, Read, and Practice was used. The graph on the right-hand side shows you the breakdown for the all students for their final exam scores. So the average final exam score in the courses where Read and Practice was not used was 71.7 versus 79.4 in the sections where Read and Practice was used. We've also shown you on the graph this broken down by level of academic preparedness coming into the course, because as I said, we wanted to control for all of those things. So as you can see, the differences were there whether the students were less academically prepared or more academically prepared. And the scatter plot on the left-hand side shows you that same sort of relationship for the less prepared and the more prepared students. Regardless of level of academic preparedness, Read and Practice did support their academic final exam scores in the course. The same can be true of overall final exam scores. So regardless of these factors that we believe contributed to it, and what you're seeing here is high school grade point average, regardless of high school grade point average, there was a significant impact on a student's final course grade if they use Read and Practice in the class. And putting that really clearly, what that means is we can confidently say that whatever the level of academic preparedness, baseline level of motivation, or other background or demographic characteristics are, instructors can be confident that if they use Read and Practice in their course, their students will have higher final grades in that course than if they did not use Read and Practice or if they use some other digital tool, which is a really important finding specifically because we can control for all of those other things. Now, a lot of other detail went into this, and I'm happy to direct you to the full technical or research report around it, but just giving you a high-level overview of the approach that we took to look at those cognitive outcomes and the findings that we observed. Of course, we also want to look at the non-cognitive impact. If you think back to the learning science foundations of Achieve, Read, and Practice, a lot of those basic constructs are non-cognitive constructs, and those things are really important. When we partner with instructors on these impact studies, one of the first things that we do before we even start the study is that we ask instructors, what are the things that you are interested in? What is the evidence that you use when you're deciding whether or not to use a tool in the classroom? What questions do you want answered? And instructors who partnered with us on this study, they tended to be interested in three sort of non-cognitive factors. Certainly, they all said they wanted to increase academic performance, final course grades, final exam scores, but they also wanted to understand whether there were digital learning tools that could help support student perception of the course, their likelihood to take another course in the discipline, and if it could promote study skills. What a lot of instructors have been telling myself and my researchers lately is that they spend a lot of time trying to teach students how to study, how to stay on top of their work. And if there were tools out there that could support positive student behaviors and positive student study skills, it would save them time, create efficiencies, and really support their students and support the whole learner of the student. So instructors in this study asked us if we can think about these three things. So what we found at the study is that students who used Read and Practice tended to enjoy their course more than other courses they took that semester. We asked students to either strongly disagree, agree, or strongly agree. And you can see here that the light blue is Read and Practice. And in all of the cases where Read and Practice was used, students had higher perceptions of the courses. Then when we wanted to look at whether or not, what is their likelihood to take another psychology course, if the graph that you see on the left-hand side, 64% of students indicated that overall, 64% of students indicated that they would be interested, they would likely take another psychology course. 71% of those who had used Read and Practice indicated that they would likely take another course, and 57% of those in the comparison group. Now that is all well and good, and it's a really impactful finding. But of course, whether a student is a psychology major or not is really going to impact whether they're going to take another course in the discipline. And so again, because we were able to collect data on what a student's major was, we were able to break down that information by whether they were a major or a non-major. And again, while the proportion of students who indicated that they were likely to take another psychology course substantially decreased among the non-majors, there is still a very significantly higher proportion of students who are non-majors and indicated that they're likely to take another psychology course after having used Read and Practice than students in the comparison groups. So essentially what that means is even within whether or not a student was a major in psychology, the discipline studied here, Read and Practice, the students who use Read and Practice were more likely to indicate they would take another psychology course. And then lastly, what we wanted to look at were study skills. And again, you'll see if you look at the full Read and Practice report that we have a lot of evidence to suggest that using Read and Practice did support study skills. But one finding that was particularly interesting to me that I wanted to share is that we looked specifically at students who reported to us that they were first generation students or students or people that were the first person in their family to attend college. We know based on a whole host of research that students, that first generation students are significantly behind in some of the study skills that non-first generation students have when they enter college because they have been taught by family members who have attended college various study skills to use once they attend higher education. So looking here at first generation students, we wanted to understand whether that subgroup of students perceived themselves to have developed better study skills using Read and Practice. We asked the same question of the students in the Read and Practice group and the control group. And what you can see here is that among first generation students, those who used read and practice perceived themselves to have developed better study skills than students who were in the control group, suggesting that the use of read and practice supports the development of study skills among all students, but specifically among first generation students who we know enter college often lacking those important skills. So again, as I said, these are just some of the important findings because I want to be respectful of your time, but I welcome you to look at the full research report. There is much more detail. But before we run out of time too much, Scott, I'd love to hand it back over to you so that you might demonstrate some of these features that we just talked about.
Thank you very much, Kara. And as Kara noted, we do share these full papers on our Learning Science page. So if you're interested in doing that and reading them, just go to the Learning Science page and you will have access to all of them. As promised early on in the webinar, I am going to briefly show you what read and practice looks like to the student and instructor. This is the read and practice and the Achieve platform that you're looking at on your screen right now. And I'm going to go and open up. Actually, I'm going to go here, open up one of the learning curves. Now, I'm sure some of you are familiar with learning curves, so I apologize for that. But this story really does begin with learning curve, and that's what you're looking at on your screen here. It is an adaptive quiz. The goal is to fill this bar. It has anywhere from 2 to 6 topics per quiz. That's part of the adaptive nature of it. I'm just going to go ahead and answer this. I don't know the answer. Oh, I got lucky. So I got that question right. I earned the 15 points. I'm working towards filling my bar. I'll go with France blocked the overland routes. Okay, did not, and I get some feedback on that. So not only am I told I'm wrong, but I get some feedback. I can still answer this question correctly for 5 points. So even though I don't have the answer on my first choice, I can still continue to earn points. I will never lose points. If I don't know the answer, and I clearly don't, to the question, there's a couple of things I can do. The encouraged thing is to read the ebook. So each of these questions is meta tagged to a small section of the ebook. And that small section of the ebook will have the answer to the question. So as you can see, this is not a very large section. Based on research, students, anyone, reading to answer a question that tends to be stickier than just reading, rereading, highlighting. They tend to retain it better later on. So that is encouraged behavior, checking the ebook. I can also take a hint. That's not discouraged, but I will lose some question value that I can earn by taking that hint. Okay, back to the study. As you can see, we get a study plan when we're done, but that's not what I actually wanted to show you. I want to show you some of the metrics and how this works. So I am going to go ahead and populate this with hypothetical data. As you can see, I had mentioned this is 4 sections, 4 topics, 150 points per topic. You as the instructor would have the results from all of your students. So the first take, the second take, I'm going to get into that in a second. That's something that sets Achieve Read and Practice aside from learning curve. But you get this readout on each one of your students and on your class. So you know how your class is doing in terms of, well, this is your data on your class. This is how they're doing in each of these sections. There are no red flag sections, but oftentimes there will be. Let's take a look at some student data. For instance, this particular student, if this was your class, obviously worlds collide and to a lesser extent, Europe expands its reach. Might be areas where you're thinking, okay, maybe I need to hit that in the lecture, or maybe there's something I need to do to reinforce that. They aren't getting it. The student also gets this data on his or her performance. So there's a lot of data that the student gets, a lot of data that you get that is actionable, so to speak. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the preview again. So as I had shown earlier, you continue to answer these questions. I believe he was going to the Indies. And as I get these questions right, the question value will go up. So the next question from the topic I answered that last one on is going to be a 25-point question. It'll be a harder question. That's part of the adaptability of read and practice, of learning curve, and of read and practice. If I'm getting harder questions correct, I get even harder questions. If I get those incorrect, I get stepped back down to easier questions that have a smaller point value. By this nature, students that are prepared, students that that know the material well, are going to take a lot less time to get through this. They're going to get harder, higher point value questions. They're going to finish fairly quickly. Students that don't know, that really need the help, they're going to get the help. The other piece of adaptivity on this is, as I mentioned, there are 4 topics on this, and when we looked at the sample data, we saw the topics that make this up. At the halfway point, each student is going to get a customized version of the quiz based on where they're not doing as well. So this particular student, the second half of the quiz, is going to be a lot of this. Not going to be none of this, but it's going to be largely these areas where they're not doing as well. That's the second piece of adaptivity in read and practice, or in learning curve, which is also in read and practice, sorry. What does make Achieve Read and Practice different from learning curve is after you finish the learning curve quiz and read and practice, you get this check your understanding question for all the areas you did not do well. So you're asked to answer this question and get it right. And if you don't get it right, you got to try again and start from scratch. I'm not going to answer all 6 of these, but you have to answer these questions and get them right. And once you do so, you can avail yourself to a retake. So in this case, the student had 72% the first one, 95% on the second one. And we're finding students doing this a lot. Oftentimes students doing this as a means to study for a quiz or a test, going through the learning curve formative quizzes, seeing especially where they hadn't done as well, answering the check your understanding question, and availing themselves of the retake. Now the grade remains this first assignment. And again, grade is just a completion grade because all you need to do is fill the bar. There's a lot here. I could probably talk for half an hour unpacking a lot of this stuff. Hopefully that gives you a fairly decent idea of how learning curve works and what are the differences between read and practice and learning curve. That check your understanding question and the retake are the main differences between the two. So if this was just the learning curve, I would see this data over here, but I wouldn't have this option to retake. I'm going to end it there, again, in respect of your time, and solicit questions from anyone that may have them. I'm going to go ahead and check in here. Actually, we do have one question that came in, Kara. I think this one's probably more for you than anyone else.
Great.
Do you have any examples of instructors using the results to alter or improve their teaching?
Oh, great question. So yes, certainly instructors partner with us on one of the motivations for instructors partnering with us on these studies is that they want to understand sort of the impact in their individual classroom. And when an instructor partners with us on a study, they receive at the end of the study, 1, an anonymized matched data set in case they want to do their own research, 2, a classroom specific report, or in this case, a comparative classroom specific report, and then 3, of course, the aggregate report of all of the classes. And instructors use the findings, they've used the findings in 3 ways really that we've seen. The first is actually right now there is a big push at the department level to be using data-driven decision-making or research-backed decision-making. And so they bring the findings to their department to demonstrate, whether the tool is working that they have asked their students to use. And, we haven't had this challenge yet, but also if we find that it's not working, the feedback that instructors have provided that Macmillan is implementing into the tool. Fortunately, in our cases, we're finding that the tools are impactful. The other way that instructors are using the results are with this matched data set. So many instructors want to look at different research questions and analyze the data in different ways. Based on our IRB approval, they're allowed to do that with an anonymized data set for the students that provided active informed consent. But more specifically to the question asked, whether instructors change their implementation of the tool, we have found that this is true. And with Achieve, Read, and Practice, it has been in two ways specifically. One is that some instructors were using Read and Practice as a homework assignment. So they would lecture in the classroom, and then they would they would assign the activity after the lecture. But based on what they saw from some of the ways that other instructors were implementing Read and Practice, and that they were realizing higher learner outcomes, those instructors started to use more of sort of a flipped classroom pedagogy, where they would assign Read and Practice before the lecture and then lecture on the content in class. Those instructors who partnered with us semester over semester were interestingly able to provide us feedback that change definitely supported student behavior, it supported classroom engagement, and it supported academic performance in their class. And then the second way that they use the results to change their teaching is use of some of those data that Scott just showed you. Certainly instructors weren't used to using many of those analytics, but once they understood how easy it was to sort of identify concepts and identify students who needed extra supports, they were more likely to look at the analytics reports on almost a daily basis, if not a couple of times a week, so that they could stay on top of understanding whether students were doing the reading, whether they were doing the assignments, where they should focus their lectures. So really their implementation of the tool and then their use of the provided analytics for that just-in-time teaching is where we've seen where we've heard instructors tell us they have made the biggest changes in their pedagogical approaches. I hope that answers the question, but happy to follow up if it doesn't.
Thank you, Kara. Again, anyone that's interested in the study can certainly go to the Macmillan website and go to the Learning Science tab, if you will, at the Macmillan website. It's in the left-hand side of all of our pages.
Yeah, and if you're
speaking of which, we do appear to have one more question, and it is about how do you find, if your title has it. If you go to achieverp.com, now, this doesn't say that up here, but I assure you that if I go to achieverp.com, it redirects to that more complicated URL. You can go to the page where you can find available titles right here. So you can see if this is available for your book or for a book that you would consider adopting. You can do a lot more stuff from here. You can actually sign into the product from here. And you can do some more browsing, if you will, on our data and the student video here, and some more supporting data, including the research brief, an infographic, and educator study. So there's quite a bit here, including a sign into the product and a listing of the available titles. One more quick check. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Appreciate it as always. Stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon at one of these virtual. Actually, I hope to see you in person. But in the interim, we hope to see you at a virtual event in the near future. Thank you very much.
Bye now.